to everyone attending the University of Washington Supply Chain Transportation and Logistics webinar. We're going to have a conversation with the experts entitled Discussion on Navigating Supply Chain Management Through COVID-19 Disruption and Recovery, which I think, given today's circumstances, could even be broadened even more to geopolitical issues. We have a lot to talk about today. But before we do, I would like to start with some introductions. I'm John Dew. I'm going to be the moderator for today's discussion. And just to give you a background on myself, I've spent 35 years in the transportation and logistics industry, worked for 2 US flag ocean carriers, APL and Sealand. I was an executive with logistics provider LogNet, as well as Expeditors International. Currently, I'm on the board of last mile vaccine distribution NGO Village Reach. I'm on the board and faculty of University of Washington's SCTL program. And I'm admitted to practice before the Federal Maritime Commission. So that's a brief rundown on myself. Let's start with our esteemed panel. Anne?
Yes. Good afternoon or good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We're happy to have you, and I think we're all pretty keen to be discussing sort of disruptions and supply chain strategies today. This is a panel of our some of the faculty in the Master of Supply Chain Transportation Logistics program that I founded about a decade ago. I've been a professor at the University of Washington since 2005 in the Civil and Environmental Engineering department, and my research focus is on freight transportation and logistics, which is why I lead the SCTL activities. Before being a professor, I was a consultant for some time, looking at primarily at routing and scheduling problems in aviation. But we also did some other market research and decision analysis work. And that was how I got involved in transportation itself and found my true love.
Very good. Todd.
All right, Todd Smith, executive and independent consultant. Most recently, a company called GlobalFoundries, which is one of the leading semiconductor foundries. So we can talk about chip shortages later. Have spent a lot of my career in medtech. So that's more the tech side, many years with a large pharmaceutical company, as well as several medical device companies. Specialize in planning, forecasting, and the like. And also an instructor at University of Washington in the Supply Chain Transportation and Logistics program, where I teach supply chain risk management, which is very relevant to today's topic.
Apurva, how are you?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, John. My name is Apurva Jain. Welcome, everyone. I'm a faculty member here at the Information Systems and Operations Management Department at the Foster School of Business, University of Washington. And I've been here very, very long. Before that, my longest work experience is at Unilever in fast-moving consumer goods. Then I did bunch of consulting, and then I thought, I want to be an academic, and came over. My research area from the beginning has been on inventory flow. I think there is a lot more, transportation expertise in the room. I will stick to the inventory ideas here. And I teach an inventory management course in the SCTL program, and also process improvement and operations core in the MBA programs that we have. I have to say, this is just, we are so much, the whole supply chain thing is so much behind the scenes that I'm just so excited here that some of these things I have thrust this stuff up in everybody's, face, so to say. And I'm just so interested that you are interested, and we want to talk about that. Yeah. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you. Luis.
Hello, my name is Luis Perez. I have spent about over 30 years in supply chain logistics. My background is kind of varied. I've spent half my time with the providers of logistics services such as FedEx, APL, XPO, and I work for Kuehne+Nagel. I also spend time on the customer side or the shipper side, having worked in the pharma world for Merck, International Game Technology, and Avaya in the telecom industry. Currently, I'm the Senior Vice President of Operations for the 4PL, or the Integrated Logistics Division at Kuehne+Nagel, responsible for the Americas. I also teach a course for facility design and operations at the University of Washington, which I'm enjoying a lot. Just started doing that, and I see some of my students here in the event here. So happy to be here, and looking forward to sharing a lot more with you folks here. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Luis. Just as an administrative note for those listening, if you have any questions throughout this webinar, please feel free to submit them in the chat, and we'll try to bring them into the conversation. As I mentioned before, we have a lot to cover. This is a very big topic because, again, if you look over the last 3 years, we've gone through trade sanctions with China. We rolled right into a pandemic. We have geopolitical issues, and all of that is affecting the supply chain to some degree.
Yeah.
So to start out with our first question, how has the pandemic itself impacted supply chains around the world? Anne, you want to take that?
Yeah, and I think my experience relative to others on the panel might be sort of more conceptual. So maybe I'll start with that, and then I think there's more specific examples that other panel members could give. But my basic summary, sort of when I'm talking to friends or people outside the field about what the pandemic has done, is it's just dramatically changed. Well, one of the things is it's dramatically changed supply and demand, and the supply chain is a system constantly looking for balance. The provision of capacity is in response to where goods want to flow, right? It would be naive to provide capacity where it wasn't needed, and it would be a missed opportunity, to not provide capacity where it was needed. So the supply chain, the global supply chain, is this like living system that's constantly adjusting, but those adjustments, do take a little bit of time. And with the pandemic, we had very dramatic, so in very short amounts of time, very significant changes to what we were able to produce. Say a factory was no longer functional, or where we had demands. So people's, behaviors, we wanted gym equipment, we wanted to eat at home, we weren't going to restaurants. And so this system that was, it's sort of finely tuned to meet the needs of customers, had just huge shocks. And that's, highly disrupted and continues to cause challenges. So I guess that's how I'd sort of characterize it from the most high level view.
Panelists, anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is missed, we talk about supply disruptions a lot in the context of the pandemic, and clearly there were factories that were closed down, particularly early on. But a lot of it is demand, as Anne touched on. People's demand patterns fundamentally changed, and they wanted more stuff and less experiences. So less travel, less restaurants, but more gym equipment and electronics and things like that. And I think that really sort of perturbed the demand situation. I think a lot of what I see, you talk about an interruption. It's like dropping a pebble into a pond, and you get the ripple effects that kind of go all around. Well, someone just cannonballed into this swimming pool, right? And the waves are still bouncing around off the sides, and it's going to be a while before everything settles down again, to where people can really get a reliable demand signal.
Apurva, you were.
Yeah. Well, thanks, John. I was just interested in thinking that this is certainly a US story, but it's also, how it's impacted around the world. And I found that an interesting phrasing, as in that, say if you go to Vietnam, the stories are not so much about shortages, The stories are about how the foreign orders have dried up, right? And also there is a little bit of like, we have so much reporting now, shortages, and supply chain is taking so much blame. But say, so I'm from India, so go to India, the stories are not, people are a little culturally more accepting of shortages. Just as an example. So the impact that these press and the reportage is having here is perhaps not the same as everywhere else. And people are looking at it from different angles, as they are the suppliers, and they are thinking about the lack of foreign orders and revenues, or culturally they are more accepting of shortages. So I think sort of it's an interesting thing for me to sort of looking at the perspectives around the world.
But you bring up an interesting dynamic. Why do we have shortages? Is this only because of a pandemic, or is there something else that is more rooted into a bigger problem?
Yep, you have a few things that are going on. I think one is, you had factories that were closed down, so you lost capacity, or you can't store capacity. But in a lot of cases, the demand didn't go away. So for new automobiles, for example, right? So now everything's sort of trying to catch up. There's a big backlog to be worked through. And I think for a lot of consumer goods, there are things like that, where there's sort of a backlog. I think there's a risk to companies that they then scale their capacity thinking that this is the new world of demand, because I think in a lot of cases, once that backlog is caught up, once demand patterns shift back to where they were, companies are going to see demand drop. And so there's a risk to folks on the back end of this that there's a slump, if you will.
Yeah, John. So looking at it so I work for a provider of logistics services, right? So a lot of times we look at it as an opportunity, right? Because it looks at the unbalance of the supply chain, right? Capacity and demand. Then Anne was just mentioning that. And three things that kind of stick out when we look at this, right? The transportation, the labor, and the technology, right? From a transportation, we're hearing all the things that are happening in the ports with ships backed up. We got some intelligence and research that we provide at Kuehne+Nagel. And I heard the other day, 107 container vessel ships stuck in the US West Coast compared to 17 on an average pre-COVID, right? So you can imagine the line stacked up there, so many containers, right? The capacity that they lost is about 8%. So it's huge, and this is on the ocean side. On the air freight, is spiked up, right? Because now everybody's flying things because it's stuck in the ports, right? So it creates opportunities when another one has a challenge, right? The trucking is the other issue, right? 20,000 drivers shortage, right? I mean, that's a challenge there. From a labor perspective, I mean, we also hear that, unemployment is back to where it was in 2019. The social impact, people are now working remotely, so that creates an opportunity for flexibility, right? Technology, right? So we manage shipments for customers through the internet, right? So that creates opportunities for us, right? Because now everybody's trying to track where things are, right? If they're stuck there, we need to move them somewhere else. You need to find alternatives, an opportunity, right? But I think it's just kind of brought up some different ways of doing things, right? Maybe with the use of technology, with the mode changes in transportation, leveraging, resources and things like that. But it's just kind of opening up things up, to look at things, right? I mean, I know we're trying to get people to get back in the office, right? And the question is, what do we need to get back in the office when we're working from home, right? So obviously the social interaction is one of the big reasons there. But the big thing for me is it creates an opportunity to look at things differently. I was teaching a course last time and I was telling the students, look, learning how to do network analysis is going to become very important, especially nowadays, right? You got to find ways of how to flex the network, how to do network modeling studies, right? I mean, we covered that in one of my classes. We do linear programming studies and model that. So people are starting to recognize that those skills and those tools are important, right? So that's the way I look at it, John. Opportunities, obviously, right? The challenges that we are having now.
Exactly. But if I take a moment just to look back at the trade disruptions that we had with China, which affected the international supply chains. It disrupted the ocean network substantially, with ships being laid up, out of rotation, containers out of the network that were in the wrong place, all piling up in the United States, not getting back to Asia. We had a complete disruption at that point, which rolled right into a pandemic, which then required ships and containers to be in the right place at the right time to move at a very quick pace, which ultimately it did not. Which leads to the fundamental question: do we have a broken transportation network, a broken supply chain network? Luis, you're kind of in the center of that.
Yeah. Actually, you know, I look at it. Yeah, I mean, is it broken? I think parts of it, segments of it, gaps. I would look at it, right? It's not all broken. I think we have some segments that are working well. I mean, certainly the express side, you know, with the integrators, they seem to be having a good, well-oiled machine, right? I worked for one of them before, and they're very good at what they do. But when you start getting into other segments, for example, you know, the ocean, you know, shipments, right? I mean, the technology is lagging there. Tracking containers, right, is not something that we have. Technology like Project 44 has come up, right? And that's helping track that, and, you know, it's taking momentum there. But I think it's kind of exacerbated those gaps and try to fast track things in technology to kind of fill those gaps, right? I know people talk about the government. Where does the government play in here? Well, I think the government owns part of it, right? I mean, certainly the ports, and how do they, you know, work with the local labor unions and all that. I think more collaborative type work needs to be done there. But I think it's kind of, if you look at an analogy, right? I mean, the river has gone down. Now you're starting to see the rocks, the big rocks, right? And those rocks are what I'm talking about, those challenges. I think from a supplier of logistics perspective, is bringing, you know, the value that these suppliers are bringing to their customers, right? Whether that's technology, the flexibility, information, data, right? Those are the things that customers are looking at. Today, I can tell you, you talk about China or you talk about the Ukraine nowadays, right? Customers want to know at the detail level shipment, where are my products, right? How are you going to reroute them? And can you give me continuous information as they move through the supply chain? That's the level that they have gotten to. In the past, it was like, I tender it to the carrier, it's on this way. When it gets there, I'll get notified, that's good enough. Today, that's not good enough, right? So I think it's brought up those points to more minute detail, I guess, and more event-driven, data-driven, right? That's the other thing that I see, John.
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
no,
Ann.
I just would say, yeah, I totally agree, you know, with Luis. I definitely wouldn't say like it's broken. I mean, it's a couple things. I think one is that the industry has, I think, been remarkably dynamic and flexible in the last 2 years. And, you know, we are experiencing a pandemic and significant global disruptions. And maybe to Apurva's point, like our expectations are really high. We expect to have all the same things with all the same supply and at the same price available to us in the same way. So we're expecting this system to be immediately adaptable and readjustable to continue to provide us with the same things we've expected. That's that's a high bar. And you know, the lengths that all my friends in this industry have gone to, like personally in the last 2 years, to make this all work is really remarkable. So I think it's shown an immense amount of resilience, frankly, that, and you know, to my knowledge, no one actually ran out of toilet paper. You know, they were worried that it was going to happen, but I don't know anybody who actually ran out, which I think is remarkable. And so I'd like, you know, to make sure that we remember that in the context of like our sort of, you know, our expectations maybe not being completely fulfilled, but I think it was remarkably kind of well done. And then the other is that, you know, it's a competitive system where every participant needs to be, you know, a sustainable financial entity. And so having excessive capacity or having excessive supply meant you, under normal conditions, you get outcompeted. So it's a system that we've all benefited from being pretty lean and pretty and not overburdened with excessive costs. And so we also want that, right? We want a system that works at a remarkably low cost. And so I think there's maybe to some extent a disconnect, and that's what people are learning. People are learning like, oh wow, this is a really complex system that takes a lot of work to run well, and we've really, really, really taxed it. And I've actually been impressed at how well it's worked.
That's true. Yeah.
Todd, you kind of represent the shipper side of the business. From your perspective, is the transportation network or supply chain broken?
Mm-hmm.
From my perspective, no. I mean, you really, so I'm, first of all, I'm primarily an air shipper. So things like port delays on the West Coast are not bothering me. But I'm paying a lot more than I used to. I think I can't say it's broken because you look at it and you can't point to any disruption, right? The transportation network wasn't shut down by COVID. I mean, there may have been issues in getting enough drivers and some of those things. It's really been about capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And to Ann's point, you have this network that was leaned out to be as profitable as possible with a level of demand. And in that situation, whether it's the transportation network or it's somebody's manufacturing assets, you can't increase demand 10 or 20% and expect everything to be just wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what we're seeing. And it's been strained by the additional load on it, but I don't think it's broken.
Yeah.
Or what do you think?
Well, I think all the right points have been made, and I'll just sort of follow along. And made this point about access capacity and this general idea that whatever the capacity is working reasonably well. People are being really flexible.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about how we will think of, well, perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself, but next few years, and have this notion of extra capacity, extra buffer should be built in. To my mind, as an outsider to transportation, one place where it would really make sense to add extra capacity is transportation. You can't expect lots of individual firms everywhere to have extra factories and extra inventory. Too expensive, right? But one would imagine that if there is extra ocean shipping capacity or air freight capacity, that would allow a better distribution of factories and productive resources, and that the connection, extra capacity in connection, perhaps far more important. And so I'm imagining perhaps that all this talk about extra capacity in future would come at the transportation sector, but that's a guess.
Yeah. Well, and I think the key thing there is, well, on the ocean side, it's infrastructure, right? It's port infrastructure.
Port infrastructure, yeah.
Because that's not flexible. If demand patterns shift around the world, you can move ships onto different strings and kind of shift capacity around. But when it comes down to a port, you're stuck, and that's really long lead time to build out.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a place where government can potentially step in and get ahead of the curve. Because I think particularly in Los Angeles, we're really behind the curve.
Yeah.
The other thing that.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, the other thing that comes to mind is business continuity, right? Because we're talking about capacity, air, ocean, ports, right? And I think, so what I hear from my customers, I'll give you some simple examples, right? How come, we're talking about China or Ukraine, right? Or expediters, the issue that they had with their hacking of their system, right? And the first question we ask, you want me to shift to somebody else? Who is the carrier that you have as a backup? Silence, right? So you talk about business continuity, I think it's highlighting a lot of those things, right? What do we have to have business continuity? People need to think about that, not just because, that will never happen, and it will be an exercise on a piece of paper. They are thinking more seriously about that, right? And looking at how do they actually fill those gaps or react to those things is important. I think it's bringing that up, right? So, we talk about that in the university at the class, right? I mean, talk about simple business continuity, right? If you have a fire here in the West Coast, where do you go start producing things? Where do you shift that from one warehouse to the other one? Where do you source product from here to there, right?
Yeah.
So people haven't thought too much about that because we've had an abundant, and the supply chain has been running well. Everything came from China. Now we're thinking about maybe we should put something in Mexico because China might have another issue. So that is another topic that's coming up in the conversations, John.
You raise a good point sort of in there. I think one of the things that I teach in my risk management class is when you look at risk mitigation strategies, you have to think about what is everybody else going to do. So a strategy that's like, hey, if my warehouse, is closed because of snow, that's kind of affecting me. Maybe it's a strategy that works. But when you have a pandemic, if everybody else is choosing the same strategy, like the backup carrier strategy, it doesn't work for anyone.
Yeah.
Well, going back to my question, is the supply chain broken? I take the position that it's severely cracked. And I say that in the context that we've evolved the supply chain, at least in my career, to a very concentrated just-in-time model. That model itself is cracked. It does not allow for flexibility when you have one shipper, one carrier, one port of entry. If disruption occurs along the network, the ability to flex and move, as you've mentioned, is compromised significantly. We would not invest in one stock, and I think we typically diversify into many to protect our interests. I think that's coming in the logistics side. That's going to be a new trend, I think, for many logistics managers. How do you diversify a network and still achieve cost effectiveness that you were trying to achieve in that concentrated model? Or is there an offset between the cost and the risks? That's I think what we're on the horizon, because it's not just a pandemic. We've seen this in trade sanctions. We've seen this with government action, geopolitical issues, storms, bankruptcies of significant providers. Any number of issues are affecting the supply chain at a greater frequency than they have in the past. So that begs the question is what alternatives are out there? You're seeing in terms of supply chains, do you see a new trend, opportunities to kind of change things up?
Yeah. Well, I think I will connect it back to the previous comment earlier. People were thinking about, is government has a role to play? Is that going to be it's somewhat of a new trend? Luis has already talked about technology, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. But to me, it seems very new a thing that is, does government have a role to play in this at all? And most of us have, grown up in this very comparative capitalistic ways of thinking. So I think most obvious answer is no, but maybe yes. And one of the things that I've always connect in my mind is that we have this idea of bullwhip effect. And we talk a lot about that in our classes. And in a one sentence answer would be that, idea would be that I'm panic buying and therefore I buy more and I'm even though I don't need it, and those orders then go back and create congestion in the supply chain. And to connect it to what's just happening right now is that there are all these, I think Luis was saying 100 ships in those Los Angeles ports. And part of that is maybe because the customers here are thinking lead times are very, very long, and therefore let me just play safe and order more. So you order more and then the containers go and join that 100+ line of ships. So that's sort of now this is a sort of a decentralization problem. Everybody's making their best call for themselves. Does government have a role? Is that going to be a new trend? And, so Joe Biden had a supply chain task force, and they tried to sort of, influence people's behavior a little bit. Is that effective or not? But just like some macroeconomic intervention, it would be an interesting thing to think about whether in such panic buying type of situations, leading and making these problems longer at container ships, at ports and all that. Does government have a role to sort of say, hey, calm down, everybody, just there is a cap on how much you can order right now. Don't just compete with each other and place larger orders. I'll be curious to see if any of that plays out as a new
Well,
trend.
for Apurva, I'll ask the panel. I think that's the appropriate question. Does government have a role in supply chain?
Well,
And what role would it play?
well, I mean, like in the last, 50 years in this country, we have encouraged competition and private provision of goods movement services, right? That is done by private companies, and they are not, there is no, like we're now using this term, the supply chain, like it reflects some kind of national supply chain system. That doesn't, like, it's just a collection of actions of carriers and shippers and port operators and, state and municipal governments. And so there's no unifying vision or oversight over this system. And it has the market to respond to. And that's, why we started by talking about supply and demand. So shifting to a way of thinking where we don't trust the market and we believe that there should be some some shared vision, some shared priorities, is an immense shift. I don't think it's practical, but other countries do think about it, at least in a much more kind of organized or proactive way. The Canadian government has reorganized their infrastructure management into a less siloed, more integrated infrastructure agency, and have national kind of corridor priorities. They have, sort of a West Coast corridor where they're coordinating development of the railroads and the ports so that they function more efficiently as a system. We haven't done that, and we haven't had, a national leadership effort in terms of how do goods move? Do we have that data? Do we have a shared strategy or vision? So that would be a very, very big departure from what we've done.
Sure.
And just to add to that, if you look at the way the government has treated transportation, it's been a monolithic, mode-specific policy making entities, railroads, maritime, truck, et cetera. We have an integrated system now. If anything, the port congestion issue taught us that integrated system is tightly woven. As we saw backups in Chicago on the rail, going right into Los Angeles, the inability to get containers to the railroad, lack of truckers, it just started a snowball effect down the line. We are not looking at it as an integrated system. I do believe government has a role. The question is, how do they have a role in its current structure?
Yeah.
Federal Maritime Commission has come out with an investigation of the supply chain 2 years ago. That was really the first attempt of government really trying to identify the supply chain entities. The Department of Transportation has just now started to look at it. But there's a lot more in terms of how do you create policy in an integrated network? And we've not, as you said, done that.
Yeah. And my work as a researcher has focused on the integration of the public and the private sector, because that's a challenge. That is not something we've historically done. So I think a priority for that is certainly better communication, additional, information sharing and decision making by a shared group, because we do have, the vehicles, and to the large extent, the infrastructure is also provided by the private sector, and then we have the public sector providing some of that infrastructure. And unless those two pieces are coordinated, I do not believe that we're going to develop a policy or a framework that's actually going to produce a good outcome.
What was interesting in some of the postmortem studies coming out of the port congestion fiasco was there's been a change in the distribution networks within shippers. The idea of transloading containers in Los Angeles to rearrange the merchandise for redistribution to regional DCs and ultimately to stores changed for many companies, where containers were offloaded in LA. And because of e-commerce, they don't have to go on to regional distribution centers. That in and of itself started a backlog because you had containers that were no longer moving out of the LA area. They were concentrating now in Los Angeles, and another attribution or another contribution to the port backups. How do we start looking at not only the transportation mechanisms, but the distribution patterns that affect that?
So one thing we need is visibility, right? So if we're going to have policies and programs to manage that, we need to know what's happening. We being the decision makers don't currently have visibility into that. And so that's the one thing that would need to serve as a foundation for that kind of management. So like in aviation, there's immense visibility into the movement of vehicles, the movement of goods, the movement of people, right? We know how late each plane is. We know how many people got on and off each plane, because that information sharing is required. We don't have that particularly in the trucking sector, right? We have very little visibility into the existing movement of goods. And that's something that's very hard to build a policy program around if you don't have that kind of data. So that's a foundation to that kind of understanding and then progress.
Does that become a role for research within the universities? Is that
Definitely. I mean, some of what we're doing is trying to fill those holes and try to build that understanding without those kinds of systematic databases. So we do a lot of our own data collection. We do a lot of scraping of existing data, and we're using data that was created for something else and trying to interpret that for additional purposes. Yeah.
Very good. So with all of this happening, there's also an issue of cost in the supply chain. Many shippers have seen enormous freight rates, particularly on the ocean side. We're seeing very high fuel costs charges now on domestic as well as international transportation. How do costs affect the supply chain? Todd, why don't you?
Yeah, I think, as a shipper, you have to then rethink your network structure. And so, classically, companies were doing lots of production in China or the Far East. And as I think Luis mentioned earlier, now you're thinking about Mexico. You're thinking about nearshoring a lot of things, certainly at least in this hemisphere. And part of that is just as the freight equation changes, right? When it was cost effective to make something in Asia, when a container costs, I don't know, $4,000 to move across the Pacific, it may not work when the container costs twice that or 3 times that, right? So you have to really rethink that in terms of your manufacturing strategy. And I think even though I believe rates will return close to where they were at some point, as carriers add capacity and things like that, I think as a shipper, it makes me really want to rethink, what I'm doing, because I could get burned by this again, or maybe the rates won't go back to where they were, and that fundamentally changes the equation. So I think you'll see more regional manufacturing, manufacturing in North America for North America, manufacturing in Asia for Asia, some of those things. That also adds other resilience because you're not manufacturing for the whole world in one site. You're going to split that up, which has other cost implications, but I think just all of my clients, the folks that I'm working with, the companies, that's definitely top of mind is to rethink that. So no big changes yet because these things take time, but I have seen already companies that were entertaining moving production to Asia stop and say, we're not doing that.
Yeah, John, from a provider's logistics services, I keep saying this, it's an opportunity, frankly, because, we deal with the heads of logistics organizations, supply chain executives. And I remember one of them told me the other day, I have become almost like the finance guy reporting to the penny of how much more my freight has gone up, right? All of a sudden, I have to go find opportunities to curb that cost. Obviously, that's limited, right? Because now I'm going from 2 knots per hour to 100 miles an hour, from ocean to air, right? And his budget is skyrocketed, right? So they become very financially driven, right? They want to see savings, they want to see cost reductions, they want to see optimization, right? Those are things that they're looking at, right? So that creates opportunities for logistics providers, right? Because obviously you can help them with doing network analysis, trying to optimize things, consolidations, filling more containers, reducing the cost per unit. I mean, those are the things that they're talking about. I can tell you, it's almost like you're having a conversation with the controller sometimes, right? And so their metrics change also, right? I mean, now they are talking about cost per unit more, and they get to the very minute detail. It creates opportunities too to look at projects, for example, on continuous improvement, right? They want to know, how do we change processes, right? How do we change processes at the level of building orders, right? What kind of orders do we ship? How do we ship what kind of products, right? So they're getting to more minute conversations and details, right? It brings the point of the data that Anne was bringing, right? I mean, where do they get this information, right? So they want the information and they want it now. They can't wait till the end of the month, right? I want to know it day by day, and I want to track it, and I want to project, and I want to predict, right? That's another thing that I see happening out there. So, technology, data, information, real-time things, those are the things that are coming up. So companies that are looking at doing that, obviously are going to capitalize on that, right? So I mentioned Project 44, right? Who was going to think that Project 44 was going to become, the network that's going to provide a lot of the information on event tracking, right? They track from containers, to air shipments, parcels and things like that. And it's still not done. I mean, it's a huge network, right? Like Anne was saying, the supply chain is not just something that is beginning. I mean, it's a web, it's a network, right? With many players involved. The other thing that I see is the collaboration, right? So even though I work for one of the big companies, Kuehne+Nagel, we have to deal with all the other guys, the DHLs, the FedEx, the UPSs, and we talk to them all day long because we manage these control towers where we book shipments for customers, and that involves many of them. So no longer is like I can talk to the other guys because they're my competitor. I have to talk to them because they're all the alternatives, right? So the collaboration is the other thing that I see heightened, in these conversations here. Just to kind of mention some other things that I see from a supplier of logistics services.
Let me ask a more pointed question. From the shipper's point of view, from many shippers' point of view, that when disruption occurs, it affects costs. Why is that happening? What is it about disruption that more times than not increases the cost to the transportation user or within the user of the supply chain in terms of the end product?
Yeah, I mean, I look at it as a, lack of having the planning well laid out and plan, and having the processes that go with the planning, right? For example, if we're not gonna, again, I go back to business continuity, right? If we're not going to be able to use this type of mode or this lane, what's the backup plan, right? Do we have 2 carriers lined up here that we have a contract with, so that we don't just have to go call the next guy and that guy is going to give me the spot rate, which is the list rate, which is 3 times more than what I should have had if I had a contract, right? So I think lack of projecting and planning ahead, lack of thinking what if, right? I mean, those are simple things I see out there, right? And again, the conversations, well, I can ship this, in the containers in the ocean because there's 100 ships backed up there, so ship it here. Well, guess what? I think Todd said everybody's doing that, so the capacity is not there, right? So, I want to help you, Mr. Customer, but you know what? You happen to not have a contract, and now I'm going to go tell the other guys, the integrators, to give me space in the airplane. They already have it booked, and you got to get in line. So, welcome to the real challenge we got now, right? So it's making them think, maybe I should really have backups. Maybe I should have contracts lined up. Maybe I should have, be thinking about the what if. Maybe I should be doing some network analysis and playing the what if. Maybe I should be doing it continuously, not just once and shelve it, right? Those are things that I see and having conversations, right? Sometimes I get customers wanting to hire my people. And I said, you know what? No, I can do that because I serve many masters here. If you hire them, yeah, that will be a solution for you, but it will be a problem for many other customers that we provide this service to. So it becomes an opportunity too, right? But it's, I see the lack of planning, projecting, business continuity. Those are things that are coming up, So what I tell, for example, the students is, what a great time for you guys to be studying supply chain, logistics, and transportation. The world is just broad and huge. You can major and specialize in many different areas: planning, logistics, transportation, technology. So it's huge, right? But so that's how I look at things, John.
Apurva, do you have any comments to this?
Yeah, I'm thinking about a few things here. Your idea about cost and the focus on cost, and it's sort of very hard to see that changing at the end of the day. In all of this business, we say cost, time, quality. There are trade-offs, and we sort of faster times will mean more cost or disruptions. But so the focus on cost would remain, and then Todd talked about that maybe bringing manufacturing closer perhaps would help with that cost equation. And I'm thinking about how a company will think about making that decision. And I put, if I'm trying to think about getting manufacturing closer, the cost is very visible to me. But how am I measuring the benefit? Well, when will the next pandemic going to happen? I don't know. So how would I face that increase in cost of bringing manufacturing closer and offset it against some perceived very long-term benefit? So, and that's a hard call for me to make. So to think about that is likely to happen. And also connecting back to the government support issue that we were talking about earlier, to the same story. Well, government says, hey, I'm going to pay you, bring chip manufacturing back. Well, that starts the story here, but bring chip manufacturing back here, which also sets up a sort of a, perverse incentive. Now I'm not even going to think about bringing anything back unless government is giving me some carrots, right? So I will only bring things back if government shows me some carrots, right? So lots of interesting things here. Go ahead. Yeah.
You're not going to actually bring anything back, right? Because semiconductors is probably an extreme case. If you spent $10 billion building a fab in Singapore, you're not going to pick it up and move it to Texas. What you are going to do is, when it comes time to build your next $10 billion fab, okay, now that one goes in Texas, right? But there'll still be, a lot of this, or a lot of these assets, production assets that are overseas, and you just can't walk away from that. But as you look to expand capacity, that's really where the opportunities are, and companies are looking at, what has the cost equation changed? And I think I would say that it has. And people are going to weigh the lead time component. I think in the past it was like, oh, it's this much cheaper in China, and they never really thought about, they thought about the freight cost. They didn't think about the fact that it took 45 days to get here. And now that is much more front of mind. And so maybe I'm not willing to do that for a few pennies. If I can do it in Mexico and it's almost just barely more expensive, I'm going to do that because I see the value of the shorter lead time.
So we got a couple of questions in the chat, which is fantastic, because obviously we can talk about our own questions for a long time, but we want to get to yours. So the first question was just on the topic of continuous improvement. I believe that there's enough consensus that Agile might work kind of in some contexts, maybe more certain, more predictable ones, but a lot of organizations kind of need something looser. And so he said, vague combinations of Agile and traditional. How do the panelists view innovation methodology? What would they like to see? Sort of Agile has been around for 20 years, so it's what's next? And I don't know if that's, I think both conceptually, what is the strategy? And I think maybe John, you could start to talk to that, because you mentioned a trend that I think is a response, right, to the failures of Agile.
And Luis touched on this a little bit. If we get to a more diversified logistics model, technology is going to be critical in the ability for visibility from supplier through the transportation network into delivery. We do not have that today, but it is going to be essential in managing that type of network moving forward.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
you
think
know-
every day there's more data, and companies are still learning how to use it and what to do with it to make faster, better decisions. And I think that trend's going to continue.
Yeah, no, and I look at it, I mean, sometimes, we think supply chain is like something big, ethereal, right? That people don't understand. But what I see customers looking at is the processes, right? How do I make this process more efficient? Where do I get the information to make that process more efficient, right? At the order level, right? At the event level. How do I get that data reliably, right? So that I could track that on an ongoing basis and not be thinking about the next month, the next quarter, but how about tomorrow, day in, day out, right? So I see customers getting down to those levels of detail and frequency and simple things, right? We're not talking about rocket science processes here, right? So they're looking at that, right? And I think that's what's helping them. You talk about the cost, right? That's how they are understanding the cost, the drivers, the levers, right? Because I think in the past is like, well, I'm going to measure, how was my on-time delivery by X carrier? Well, you measure that at the end of the month. So now is lagging indicators. They want to know leading stuff, right? How do I know I'm going to get to the end of the month to hit that number that I have for a cost? And the way they are looking at things is more real time, on time, every day, very simple steps, right? So I think they're trying to understand that, and data is key to that, right? Because without the data, I mean, you can really measure or get a sense of whether you're improving or reducing costs and improving on the supply chain levers, right? But I think they're looking at that, and that's driving technology to come up more and more, right? I mean, so now again, they want to know, where's my stuff, and when is it going to be there, right? Can you project that? And if it's not going to get there, can you flex and divert it, right? So forget about, leaving it there. So that's what they're looking at. Very simple process, looking at efficiencies, leveraging data at the more, I guess, granular level in real time. That's what I'm seeing out there.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, you could, you almost think of this as like, there is a process of process improvement, and can I automate that process of process improvement? There is enough data already there. And so there are definitely new initiatives like process mining and even simpler things like robotic process automation. And once that gets built up, this existing data, let me automatically use it to get to the next step. And so this continuous improvement that the question was talking about, is it possible to automate it somehow? And that's, I think, it's a very interesting idea that's happening now.
Yeah, and like what revisions or modifications to our kind of platforms are required to allow that kind of flexibility? I think a lot of the platforms that we're operating on now were really designed at a time when there was less need for flexibility. And you can almost see it in the structure of those data systems. And so some of the growth and innovation is happening where they're acknowledging the need for sort of dynamism and flexibility in the foundational structure of those operating systems.
Logistics flexibility will not come without the underlying technology to support.
Right. Yep. Yeah, exactly. And that can be like vehicular, that can be routing or scheduling algorithms, that can be contracts. So there's a lot of ways in which that flexibility is going to have to achieve it. We're going to have to modify many elements of that decision making. So we have another question from one of our students. And he says, greatly appreciate the expertise. With all the conversation on analysis of managing your own supply chain disruptions, is there value in remaining mindful of the competitor, and is there an opportunity for collaboration? So maybe it's, what's the role of collaboration in dealing with disruption?
Well, there are models out there where people have partnered with their supply chain. They're few and far between. The greatest advantage is the 3PL. That provides the diversified network itself under one roof. But noticing the question, it has roots with an NGO. NGOs in particular do not play well together. They are very siloed, and there's a lot of opportunity for them actually to start working together and partnering to take advantage of the logistics system and lowering costs.
Yeah, and John, so having worked in the pharma sector, right? The pharma sector, I used to tell people, is probably the last one to open up and start kind of collaborating, right? Because they were very inwardly focused. I know Todd worked there too, so he probably has some opinions there. But I see that opening up more. So I think the individual here is asking about medicinal supply chain pathways, and so there's more collaboration. I can tell you from working for a logistics provider, they're coming together, right? And they're working on things that really they always saw as like, I know this and this is my process, and I'm not going to share that. I'm not going to collaborate. I'm not going to share data. That's becoming a little bit less restrictive, right? I mean, the logistics providers have sectors, and the life sciences and healthcare and pharma is one of the biggest ones and strongest ones, because the industry is opening more to collaboration and leveraging technology, right? That is happening, and they recognize that they're not going to compete on how they move the goods to the end customer. They're going to compete on their how they make the products, what the formulations are, how they ship it there, how they package it. That's not really their competitive advantage. So I think there's more of that happening. So I would almost encourage that individual to look at some of the providers of logistics services, because there are practices there that are becoming more open and available there, and the logistics providers are bringing the collaboration of those different players in the supply chain to make that available. So
absolutely true. I think 3PLs really have stepped in to fill some of these gaps, so the farmers won't cooperate with each other, but they'll cooperate with a third party. and there are a number of cases, like I know when I working in Europe in particular, where companies have stepped in and they're basically doing the last mile logistics, or DC to hospital or pharmacy, for a bunch of pharma companies. And in doing so, they get a scale so that they can actually do it at a cost that is well below what the individual companies would have to pay to ship their smaller volumes. And so the pharma company saves money while that 3PL earns a pretty healthy profit. So those models, I think that's more, you're going to see more of that. There are similar examples I can think of in Asia where that's happening already today.
Very good. Well, we're running out of time. I want to thank all of our panelists. It's been a very enjoyable and spirited conversation. To our viewers, if you want to see more of this, let us know what you'd like to see or hear. We're always willing to look for ideas and really appreciate your comments. So to everybody, thank you and have a good evening. Take care.
Thank you very much for very interesting conversation. Thanks for the questions, folks.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, and I just there's an email in the chat. If you do want to follow up with any questions or comments, please, you're welcome to do so.
Thank you.
Thank you.